And I always wanted to be a composer. That was the dream. That was always the goal. That was what all of my life was working towards. But I didn't really know that that was going to be a composer for film or television.
Hey folks, Brian Smith here with Dream Path Podcast, where we get inside the heads of talented creatives from all over the world. Today we talk to Roman Molino Dunn. Roman is a film composer and a film and television music producer and engineer. Roman has worked on some fascinating and compelling films over the last few years, and in 2021 alone, his work was featured in 3 of the 5 major film festivals in the world, including Venice, Toronto, and Cannes. Some of the feature films where you can hear his work as a film composer include Huracán on HBO Max, which is a psychological thriller, and the crime drama Snakehead. In his capacity as music producer and engineer, you can hear his work in the film The Card Counter, directed by Paul Schrader and executive produced by Martin Scorsese. In this chat, we really do a deep dive on some very specific questions like, what does a day in the life of a film composer look like? And he takes us step by step through that process. How does a film composer and a film music producer and engineer work with a director at the beginning of the creative process? For example, when they get the script, how do they work with that director at the end of the process if they're given a film that is already in the can, already shot? We talk about his background and his classical music training and how that helped him creatively and collaboratively, and how it helps him communicate with the folks who hire him to bring emotion, the proper and appropriate emotion to the film and to each moment of the film. So this was a great conversation where I learned a lot about an industry I really didn't know much about going in. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. So without further ado, let's jump into my chat with Roman Molino Dunn. Well, Roman Molino Dunn, welcome to Dream Path Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for booking this on short notice. I've been following you on social media for a while, and I've noticed that your projects are just becoming more prolific and more impressive in terms of the directors you're working with, and the types of projects you're getting involved in are just amazing. I watched Snakehead. I watched The Card Counter. I watched Huracán. And gosh, you're doing some really fun stuff.
Oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate you saying that, and then also taking the time to check them out. I really do appreciate that.
Yeah, it's interesting because music in film is something I don't think most folks really pay attention to in terms of consciously. Because if you're conscious of the music, you're really not conscious of the story. So I think when most people are doing, at least me, maybe this is just me, but I focus on the story and also the emotion that I'm feeling. And of course, when you drill down on that and you really get to the root cause of why you're feeling something, it is almost always tied to either the music choices or the lack of music choices. So you have the pauses between the music where it's a decision I think the director probably makes to not have music in a certain spot. But it's like, it's so important to have somebody that knows about emotion and knows about story in the music process. So tell us how you got involved in film and television, because your journey starts way back, and I've watched a few other interviews with you. It sounds like your journey started way back when you were 3 or 4 years old, taking piano lessons and other instrument lessons. And here you are in film and television, working with some of the greatest directors and producers of all time. So how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it came about. It was a long journey. I've been doing this for a long time, but I started out doing classical music as a child, and my parents made sure I had a good musical education, and I always wanted to be a composer. That was the dream. That was always the goal. That was what all of my life was working towards. But I didn't really know that that was going to be a composer for film or television.
Okay, let's stop right there. I want to go back to the point in time in your life when you said, I want to be a composer. How old were you?
Oh, like 3 or 4. I mean, it was as soon as I started playing the piano, I wanted to play it because I wanted to make music that was my own. Um, and that kind of lended itself to some uh, non-traditional I don't want to say discovery or education, but I was the kid who didn't want to practice, uh, but instead I wanted to make my own inventions, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So you were a tough kid to get to practice the traditional way.
well, the traditional way, yeah, but I mean, it would be like the kind of thing where I played the piano for 5 hours, but I didn't do my piano lessons.
Right.
you know,
You were doing
uh,
other stuff other than the assignment.
Yeah,
Right.
but as I got older, I started to realize that I would find more creative freedom by placing these restraints on myself. And it's just a journey every musician, every composer goes through, but you each go through it in your own way. I was very lucky that there was this maybe slightly more rigid supervision over my studies. So eventually, I really did get a very good foundation. I studied uh, theory. That was, my actual bachelor's degree is in music theory. So I've always been a very strong believer in like a traditional education, just so you know where like if you want to think outside the box, you kind of have to know where the box is.
Right.
So I was very lucky to eventually learn a lot of the Western tradition, and eventually I learned Eastern traditions and other musical languages. But when I was a child, I was trying to find my own way very early on, and I think that type of um, proclivity for your own way of thinking is probably indicative of being a composer more than a performer.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you talk about other musical languages because I've always thought of music, academic music, where you're going and studying music theory and you can write notes on a page. You can listen to a composition and actually know what key it's in and what timing it's in, time signature. That type of understanding of music to me is a foreign language. And I think it taps into the same part of the brain that foreign languages do. I could be wrong, but that's just how I've always thought of it. Do you see music, like when you look back on your childhood, starting at age 3 or 4, does it seem like you were learning a foreign language, the equivalent of a foreign language?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in fact, to that end, sometimes I have a harder time finding words than I do finding melodies or just communicating like a normal human being,
Right.
because I spend so much time speaking this other language that I'm probably more well versed in communicating a feeling or an emotion using music, or just sitting down at the piano or another instrument and communicating a feeling or a thought a lot quicker than I am trying to find the verbiage to communicate it in English.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So in terms of, and we'll get to your journey, I think, down the road in the interview, but I'm fascinated by the fact that you have all of this classical training and this music theory training, yet there are other folks in the industry. Like I interviewed Richard Patrick from Filter, and his music background is playing for Nine Inch Nails and then starting the band Filter, and then he's scoring films. I don't think that guy has even a fraction of the music theory knowledge that you do. I could be wrong. Maybe that's an unfair statement, but that's just my impression of Richard. I interviewed him at his studio in Los Angeles, and he's doing fine. I mean, he's doing great and working on some fun projects. But you have this really, granular understanding of music. How does that help you in terms of working in television and film with directors who don't speak that same language as you, right? I mean,
Yeah.
most of them don't. They're coming at you with what they want as an outcome, but how do you incorporate that foreign language that you know that they don't?
I mean, I think, well, there's a few parts there. I think one of the benefits to having this understanding, the theoretical understanding, is it really manifests itself in two ways. The benefit of this knowledge, one is that I can provide revisions because when and I've worked with people who don't have classical backgrounds on many projects collaboratively, either songs or film or television, and it's just a different way of thinking. But the benefit to being educated in any craft is certainly, I think it is advantageous to be educated.
Mm-hmm.
And it depends what type of education you have, sure. And so I'm sure an individual like that is very educated in a different way in practice rather than in theory, and can translate that in there. But the benefit to having it in theory is, one, revisions become a bit easier because I understand how to make the changes
Mm-hmm.
at a very deeper level of the content of the music. And then the real benefit that I've seen in my career from having this is that I can work in a variety of styles. Like, for example, Huracán was this very synth-based, steamy, ambient situation, but then Snakehead had a lot of like waltzes in it and stuff. And then I also do pop music for dance artists, and it's all the same because I understand the music theory behind it. So when somebody sends me a reference track, I don't have to do trial and error to do it. I would just listen to the music and transcribe the notation in my head. And then once I do that, I can understand the underlying musical language of it. So being able to analyze music in whatever way you do it is really helpful when working with other collaborators, especially if they don't have the language, because it's a lot easier when somebody gives me a reference piece of music. Like if a director starts telling me what chords to use and what their melody is, it's a harder job, right? But it's a lot easier when they give me a piece of music that they like and say, I like the sadness represented here, and then I can pick it apart, what that means from a theoretical standpoint, and then write something that's similar.
Right. For me, as you were just talking, I was thinking of metaphors or analogies of other industries where, for instance, in the construction industry, if a customer, a homeowner says, I want you to remodel my bathroom or my master bedroom, if you hire someone who is really good in construction, but doesn't know about architecture, has no understanding of the history of architecture, is not an interior designer, then they're possibly going to be at a disadvantage. Not for sure, but you're just not going to have that broader sort of gestalt understanding of building and styles and function and that type of thing. And for you to not only have a pop sensibility and to work with pop artists and to, obviously you listen to current music, and even if it's not your thing, you're tuned into it, but you also have that theoretical background. So you are the architect, you are the interior designer, and you are the general contractor, all built into one human being.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, at fear of sounding, like you never want to sound elitist when you talk about music education,
Right.
because I really do think it's wonderful. There's such a variety of voices and experiences in the music composition and music for media space. But at the end of the day, I really think music education is just incredibly important. And there's other, it doesn't have to be this Western tradition of, classical music theory. It can be something else. You could study, for example, a lot of composers now are coming from rock bands, right? And it's amazing because in order for them to achieve at that high of a level in being an artist, they're obviously really good at what they do. And so it's just a whole nother voice, and they've studied that oeuvre. And, there's a whole benefit that comes from making music in that fashion that maybe you won't get in music theory training, but it's good to have a well-rounded experience. Meaning, if you did go to school for music, let me put it this way: I studied classical music very deeply, but I would not have been a good film composer right out of college. It wasn't until I started recording pop music and I started to understand music production that I was capable of making music for films of the level that I'm doing. And the same for probably a rock artist. They go the other way. Maybe they did all the music production and playing and performing, and then eventually they come back to learning some of the orchestral skill sets that they need in order to write. So everybody's got a slightly different path on it.
Right. For my listeners who probably don't know, most of them probably don't know the distinction between a film composer or scorer and someone who is an engineer versus someone who works in the music department as a producer, when you've done all those things. Can you tell my listeners what those folks do and what those titles mean in music and television?
Sure. So it is blurring. It is starting to blur heavily, just like everything is, I think, in this day of modern production technologies. Traditionally, let's step back from film just for a second, but in music, you have the artist, whoever's performing it, and then you have the recording engineer, and that's the individual who will be hanging up the microphones, getting the recording console set, hitting record on the program, editing it, that kind of thing. And the producer would be who oversees that entire process and also has creative input in things. Now, they're all kind of blurring together. And like when I do a song for an artist, for example, I'm the recording engineer, I'm the producer, I'm the songwriter, they're just the performer. And I'm doing all of those services. And when I do music for film, oftentimes I'm also doing if I'm composing a film, I pretty much engineer, record, produce, mix, master my scores. That's what I do. I'm a full package kind of music composer. Not on every project. For example, like on the Card Counter, I didn't compose the score for that. I was a music producer. So in that production, and to some degree, that was what you were talking about, where people have differing backgrounds. The composer to that was somebody from a rock background. And I came in to help make sure the score was recorded in a way that was flexible for the music editor, because this was a different type of production that had some old school roles. And then the music editor would take the music that we recorded and lay it in with the director and make some adjustments that the director wanted to do after the initial recording has been done.
Okay.
And so that's not always the case. That's somewhat, it's very common, but it's not always the case that you have a music editor anymore. Higher end productions, and particularly film and television will rely on it more, because television deadlines are very quick. So like TV shows that I've done, for example, I would make the music and then send it to the editors. I never saw the film, and I wouldn't do it directly to picture. The deadlines were too tight. We need this kind of music, and use some of the themes you did for this. And then our music editor will put it together while you're working on the next batch of songs. Okay. And that's not my preferred way to work. I prefer feature films, where I get to watch it and write music to every single move, every single word that comes out of these actors' mouths and the way that it does. But it's just a different way of, producing film or television.
So what does that look like when technically, I'm guessing that you have to have timestamps of your recording and the movie that you're watching, so that your thought process is reflected exactly in the timing of what you're matching up music to film. So what program are you using? And not to get too techie, but I'm just curious, how do you do that? Sure.
So yeah, for films, when I'm scoring directly to picture, which is what I think we're talking about here, as opposed to the more library kind of approach, I use Pro Tools. which is made by Avid. It's pretty much an industry standard in the television and film world as far as the audio post-production part of things. A lot of people will do their writing of the music in Cubase is a very common one. But because everybody eventually moves to Pro Tools to do their final mix and to deliver it to the film editors, that's done in Pro Tools. I do the entire process in Pro Tools. And it's not uncommon. I mean, a lot of composers of all levels use Pro Tools to score.
That's what Richard Patrick uses too.
Yeah. I mean, it's the thing, it's like I said, it's been around a long time, industry standard. And the way it works is you drop in the film or whatever part of the film they've given you. If it's not done yet, I love to come in very early in the process if possible. And I'm sure most composers probably do too, if the budget's good enough. I mean, if the budget's not very good, it has to be an efficient job. Because this is a day job for us. So it's got to get done in a reasonable turnaround. But when possible, I love to get brought on very early. And when you do that, sometimes you might not get the whole movie. You might just get a scene when it's ready to start workshopping ideas.
Yeah.
But when I do get an entire film, I drop it in, and then, not to get too nerdy, with all the timestamps, you'll go through and you'll start putting markers for the moments that you'd like to hit. And that starts to map out the structure of the composition as far as the form goes, or the skeleton of what you're doing. And then you start to get a bit more granular where, this is the big kiss. So I want a big harmony here. And you start to map out your chord progression. And then once you have that, skeleton or form, if you will, you would use that the same way a composer would use like a sonata allegro form, or, in pop music, a verse, chorus, bridge. You're seeing these sections, and then you write music to that form when possible. Sometimes it's a little less organized than that,
Yeah. That's fascinating. So if you get involved early, really early in the process, and let's say you're given a script and you don't have anything to look at visually other than the words on a page, do you get anything from a script? I mean, of value as a composer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I'm doing that right now. I just got a script for a new feature, and I'm going through and doing some sketches. And I love that a lot, actually, because
like drawings?
No,
what do you mean sketches?
So sketches
musical sketches.
Yeah, musical sketches.
Okay,
yeah.
Got it.
So just they used to be back in the day, more just like piano demos kind of thing. But now with modern technology, they're pretty much fully composed, produced, recorded pieces of music. And sometimes they get used in the film also. If the sketch is just so awesome, maybe it'll be used for a moment that it doesn't have to be to picture, like a montage, or maybe they'll cut to it. And what that means is the editor will go in and use that piece of music and make all their edits based on your piece of music. So it's kind of backwards to what you would think about regular film scoring. And that's a really awesome, a wonderful thing when that happens, because then you're like in the DNA of the film from the beginning, and then it kind of composes itself. That's what happened with Huracán. I did sketches or overtures to a quote, and then once we had that, most of the palette, if you will, the instruments.
That's a good word, palette.
Yeah, the sonic palette. Yeah. What came from that original overture. So when you get the script, it's wonderful, because you can have, but again, this is not to get off of the artistic part of it for a second, but the pragmatic, professional business aspect of it is that is very timely, time consuming, and can become maybe not a reasonable thing to always do if it's a lower budget production, know?
So talking about the business aspects of this, tell us, and I'm not asking for private, financial information about how much you make, but I'm just curious about the financial arrangements with a film production company or maybe an indie filmmaker. Are you charging by the day? Are you charging by the project? How do you make sure that you're fairly compensated for the time that you're putting in? And also, are there circumstances where you can be compensated on the back end,
Yes.
maybe like some of the talent would be?
Yeah, absolutely. So I could speak to all of that. For most of the projects that I do, it's a project-based rate. Traditionally, those things were based on a percentage of the overall budget of the film, and then you would just choose, can I work for that rate, right? And so that's still kind of how it's done to some degree. Most of the time, you get approached with a number. They know how much money they have set aside for it, and that's what it is. And they're going to try to find a composer who fits that rate. And then sometimes they can't find a composer who fits that rate, and then they'll up their rate and start looking, because the pool gets smaller and smaller.
Right.
If you go up and if you go down, because you're doing it based on experience most of the time. They're looking for a composer who has enough features under their belt or enough TV shows under their belt. It's just like anything, right? You want to hire an experienced individual, and what's the going rate? But that going rate tends to be based on a percentage of the overall film's budget. I've done other arrangements, but that's typically what it is. And how do you make sure that you cover your losses, so to speak? I mean, you almost always, I don't want to say you always lose money on it, but when you're passionate about your job, you're always going to spend more time than you were compensated for on it.
Right.
So,
right.
For me, it's more like I probably should have gotten paid more, based on how many revisions and how long I worked on this project. But is it a viable living? Yes, so it's okay. And when it's not, then you have to reconsider in the future the next project that looks like it. And then on the back end, the way it works is you get, depending on how your music is distributed, so actually how the film or television show is distributed, if it's on a network television show or one of the big streamers, you're going to get back end that's collected through what's called a performing rights organization. So these things called ASCAP and BMI and CSAC, they are collecting royalties the same way that when a song gets played on the radio, whoever wrote that song is getting a nickel. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, Spotify really, screwed with this, because these things are protected by law. There's rates that are set, and there's legislation behind them. And then Spotify kind of, because of the internet, was able to get away with different rates. And that stuff has since been negotiated again in the last 3 years. And it's something composers watch very closely, because, like I said, I don't always make a lot of money on the front end of a film based on how much time I spent on it. And so for me, it's very important that the government is protecting intellectual property.
Right.
I get royalties on music that is in a film if the film makes it to somewhere that reports the performances. So when it plays in the theater in the United States, I don't get any money, which is a shame. But if it plays on network television, I would.
So no box office back end.
So there's box office back end in the international markets, because they have different laws. That counts as a real performance. And I'm just talking about the composition. So some composers are able to negotiate like points, like
right in the contract.
Yeah, which is something different. But as far as like a very big composer who's putting their name on a project and maybe taking it under rate would want some points. I've done that before, where I got some points because the fee was too low. And so I said, could you sweeten it a little bit? But that's always a risky, what it's in a lot of cases, what it's saying is they didn't have the necessary budget.
Right.
And so the odds of them being able to market it very well and you getting your back end is a little bit, yeah.
Well, I've heard a lot of really awful stories about how, film studios and production companies, the way they define back end, the way they define profit almost makes it impossible to get fairly compensated on the back end unless you're, a superstar, A-list actor or something, and you have it really built in solid. But yeah, those back end deals are fascinating to me. What's the smallest royalty check you've ever received?
Well, they stopped cutting them when they get that small. So with ASCAP, I mean, there's been months in the past where it was like a penny, or fractions of a penny, but then they don't send a check. Their model now is wait till it adds up.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a tough thing. It's a real evolving field right now because of the internet. They weren't able to really quantify it quickly enough as to what, like what category does the internet fall into? Because it's not public, but is it public? It's a difficult thing. It's catching up though. I'm very optimistic actually about the future of it.
Nice. I'd like to ask you about decision making as a film composer. And the frame of reference I have for this question is that I'm sitting here in my studio and I see you're in your studio and you've got all these fancy, keyboards, and I don't even know what I'm looking at, but there's a lot of technical stuff behind you. And in front of me is a Yamaha motif keyboard. And I can get some sounds out of it. Like I know how to navigate to the sounds that I like, the grand piano sounds, but it is way more instrument than I have the aptitude to understand and have the time to learn. And there's so many options. I mean, we're talking literally millions and millions of different variations of beats and sounds that you can get out of just this one instrument. And you have lots of these types of instruments. And as a composer, you also have the ability to go get ambient sound right outside your front door, get birds, get cars driving by. And so you have so many choices in front of you as you're sitting down in front of a movie screen. Do you ever get overwhelmed by all of the decisions that you have to make? And how do you break through that feeling of being overwhelmed to actually start making decisions that you're confident about sharing with the folks who hired you?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. So one, I'm lucky that it is collaborative in the sense that I feel like I would be more overwhelmed. Like if I sit down to make a piece of music for myself, which happens very rarely these days, I face what you're describing here. Where should I start? I have all of these great instruments. I've loved playing all of them on different projects. What do I do? And that's a real problem. But when I work on a film, as soon as somebody says something about what they're looking for, I know what it is because I've spent, my entire life playing instruments and looking through sounds. So something comes to mind immediately when somebody describes, what their piece is about. I don't think I've ever had a lack of inspiration as far as which instrument to start with when it comes to a collaborative process. And that's part of the beauty, I think, about it really, I'm not making music for myself. And when you make it for somebody else, it's a lot easier to,
right.
Plant
you're given an assignment, you're given a framework. Yeah. And so you have that context as opposed to just this literally a blank slate. It's not blank because, you have some parameters. That's nice. So what does that process look like with someone like, for example, I know you weren't the film composer in the Card Counter, but Paul Schrader, huge writer and producer and director, Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, and a very famous guy. How do you work with someone like that? Or maybe a first-time filmmaker like in Huracán? I assume this was his directorial debut. Cash's directorial debut. But how do you work with them right from the beginning? Like, what are the first questions that are being asked, and how does that, what does a day in the life of Roman Molino Dunn look like as you're in that collaborative process?
Yeah, well, so the days kind of blur together, but early on it's a spotting session. So you're sitting with the with the director and the composer, myself. We'll be together watching the film and taking notes as to where we want music and what's the feeling of the music. That's not always in person anymore. A lot of times I'll just get a spreadsheet or an itemized list from somebody. And then my day is pulling up Pro Tools, dropping in the film, bringing up their list, and starting to write the first cue. And once I'll generally, like on a film like Huracán, I'll do it in reels, which means that the film's been split up into 5 chunks. Sometimes it's 3 chunks, but it's a term that comes back from when they had like spools and like reel of film, and
right.
It's just smaller portions of the film for us to work in chunks,
bite-sized.
Yeah, although they can be sometimes very long, and so I'll do a reel, and that's like 20 minutes of music often, and then I'll send it to the director, and they'll give me some feedback as to what they like, what they dislike, and we'll start to I won't do what they disliked again, and I'll do what they did like. I'll lean into that, and you start to discover their musical proclivities and inclinations for the film. And that's why it's actually quite easy for me not to get any type of writer's block or producer's block or composer's block, because these are people who don't necessarily speak the same language or know what instruments I'm using. They're just having this visceral reaction to the new music that's put to the film they've been working on for a very long time. And they tend to know better than you if it fits as to what they're trying to express in their filmmaking. And then my days are just that over and over again until we get very close to the end, at which point some more technical things start to happen, like exporting in certain formats and finalizing the mix, and sending it off to the sound designer to incorporate into the dialogue and sound effects. And yeah.
How long is that process? I mean, we're talking about a month, 2 weeks, or just varies?
Depends on the film, really. So like for Card Counter, for example, we were in the recording studio for a month with Paul. And, again, I didn't compose that one. I was just the producer. But so I'm just sitting behind the recording console for 12 hours a day for 30 days kind of thing. And
12-hour days, huh?
Yeah, I mean, those were some long sessions. And but those were rock songs, a lot of the score, right? So it's cool. That's like, it's what people think a recording studio is like, like you're sitting behind the console, someone's playing the drums, somebody's sketching on a guitar, somebody's coming in, bringing drinks, and it was a fun time, although it was during COVID, so we had to get tested daily, and this was in the height of it. It was quite a scene, man. I'll always remember that experience from, not only it being COVID, but working with Paul Schrader on anything really. It was pretty cool. But with like, for Snakehead, for example, the last film I just did, that took maybe 6 or 7 months of composing.
Oh, wow. Jeez.
Yeah. But that's
big commitment.
Yeah. But that's because they took maybe 7 or 8 years to make the film. And so every decision I made was very deliberate and had to go through a lot of, not revision, just like we just made sure it was as well thought out as it possibly could be. There was lots of scenes that went through no revision, and there was lots of scenes that went through like 10 versions. Then we found a new language, and it's great. I mean, it just depends on the project, really.
Interesting scenes in Snakehead where I think like 33 minutes in, there was almost like a Delphonics sounding Chinese pop song or rock song or disco song, and by Delphonics I mean like a Jackie Brown soundtrack
Mhm.
type of song. And then same thing at the end. There was that. So who's making those choices? Because throughout the entire film, it's very dark. I mean, dark material, dark looking,
Mhm.
and so the tones are dark, and then you have this, sort of almost whimsical song that's 30 minutes in, and then the last song, same thing. So who's making those choices, and were you involved in those musical choices?
Yeah. So in this, a lot of cases, that's a collaboration between the music supervisor and the director. In this case, there was no music supervisor. The director just chose that piece of music.
Mm-hmm.
And I only thing that I had to do with it was if they couldn't clear it, I would have to make something similar to it.
Oh, okay.
You know, I thought it was a good choice. It broke up the film, and then it put a nice bookend on the back of it. You know, it was that hinting at like some positivity and good, you know, like I don't want to, I was going to say good feeling, and then I started thinking Goodfellas because it's so related, but it's just that kind of throwback feeling on purpose so that everybody has, like, whenever songs are used in movies, a lot of times they're used for the nostalgia effect. So it's not necessarily like, is this the perfect song? Or does it convey everything we want? It's more just like, we need people to have nostalgia and attachment at this moment. And no matter what our composer does, it won't have that same feeling as something somebody might recognize, especially in a certain community. And so when that happens in a film, I'm all about it. You know, I step back for a second. This isn't about hitting the subtleties of the emotion on screen necessarily. Sometimes it is, but in a song like that, that's not what it was. So yeah, I didn't have anything to do with that one. It was cool because it was the only time in the entire film that they had that. You know, a lot of films have other music supervision, but I've been very lucky that most of the films I've worked on, I've scored the entire film without any music supervision. And then in this one, it came right in the middle, and it was actually very welcomed by myself. I thought it was a great touch.
Yeah, I'm always curious. I've interviewed a few film composers, and I'm always curious about the mix of actual, pre-written songs into the score, and how that, how those mix. And I thought it was a great mix of really dark but music, and then all of a sudden you have this sort of upbeat, nostalgic moment. And I like that word nostalgia, because I didn't come up with that word as I was feeling it, but you've just described it. And you also mentioned Goodfellas. Tell us more about Goodfellas, because I think that's a great analogous journey in terms of the sister she. Is that her name, Sister She, or?
Well, in the film, it may be a alternate pronunciation. I think mostly it was C, Sister C.
Sister C. So she is this fish out of water, dropped into this crime world. And Goodfellas kind of has a similar narrative where there's someone who is in this world who doesn't belong, and the audience knows it, and that creates a lot of inherent tension that you need in a good film, right? So were you looking at other films like Goodfellas to inspire you in any way? And what type of research did you do for Snakehead and other films like perhaps Huracán?
So I wasn't directly looking at Goodfellas when I was doing it, but I mean, it's a film everybody knows. Everybody who loves cinema is familiar with it to some degree, and I love those films. And Evan, the director of Snakehead, is a big fan of like mob films, and also because with mob films, what happens a lot of the time is half of the story is on the culture of the individuals involved with it, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, that's part of the reason that they ended up doing what they did, because of the ethnic enclaving of these characters. And I think that there are some similarities to Goodfellas in the sense there's the narration, and it's this epic in the sense that it doesn't take place over just a few days. Goodfellas is a longer timeline than this was, but I love films like that a lot. I mean, as soon as there's a narrator, I'm in it, like we're on a journey. That's just great storytelling, in my opinion. But what I did take from it was that you needed to have this touch of romance in order to sell the criminality and to pull in the viewer to relate and care about these characters. And so that was basically all I took from it. And as far as research goes, we stayed away from traditional Chinese folk instruments for the most part in Snakehead, except when there's a very big cultural moment that happens, the lion dance, which happens in Chinatown every year. And so we use music from that world to, a fresh composition, but using the same rhythms and drums that they use. But the rest of the film, we didn't want to pigeonhole this as this needs Chinese music or Chinese American music. That wasn't fair to the narrative. This isn't just, it's a story about Chinese characters, but you don't have to see them as only Chinese characters. That's not a fair telling of what they're going through. So we went with where the story went. And then with Huracán, less research was needed because I was doing the psychology aspect of it. And so that's a very natural place to go as a composer, right? Like you just need to know, what is a twisted sound like? What is, a very sad sound like? And didn't need to do as much research as somebody who's maybe doing a period drama would do.
So what are your go-to instinctive instruments or sounds for certain types of feelings? For example, if there's a kiss and it's a romantic kiss, and maybe it's the first kiss of the whole movie, you would go to what sounds for that versus a kiss that's a little more ominous.
Sure.
Maybe it's someone's like, oh, this woman doesn't know who she's getting involved with, that type of thing. So with those two scenes, what is your go-to instrument or sound?
Okay, so I'll let me flip it just a little, because the instruments are often decided by a much broader read on the film. So, for example, with Huracán, it was all of these synths and strings played through synthesizers. So the instruments had been decided, or the world of instruments, like a larger palette, like we were saying, had been decided. So then I need to play those instruments in a specific way for a specific scene. So I have go-to harmonies for the most part is what I'll do. So I can make a beautiful kiss moment on a piano and violins, which would be like, the most cliche way to do it, which is appropriate sometimes. But I could also play that same content on, some really dark bowed metals with, an old school Juno 06 playing. And as long as the chords are correct and the suspensions and the melody and the tempo and everything, you're going to get that feeling. It's just going to be in that world.
Oh, so you're using the same chords and chord progression and notes, but just different sounding instruments, or different sounding instruments.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean,
can you give us an example? Is there a way for you to do that right now, or are you not set up to do that?
Not quite set up to do that. But if you do play Chopin, for example, on a piano, or if you play Chopin on a dark, gritty synth sound, it will still have that touch of that romantic, feeling that is there because of the content of the music. Now, granted, it might end up being too dark for the scene, right? And then you have to find a different synth that might be a little bit better, or maybe you mix and match the two of those. I almost always reach for a piano because that's what I learned music on. And then secondly, I'll reach for strings, violins. I really love violas and cellos. And then I'll start reaching for synthesizers after that. But they're kind of interchangeable at this point. It's really just a matter of what language the director has chosen for the film.
Tell us about the pseudonym Electropoint.
Sure. So, as I was saying in my trajectory to becoming a film composer, it was a little roundabout. And after I got out of college and I had learned all of this classical music stuff, I needed to make a living. And it was not so apparent how to do that in classical music as a composer. And what ended up happening is I was a music transcriber, and I was writing out sheet music by ear for other composers. And that led to being an arranger. And that led me to going to the recording studio with the people that I was doing arranging for. And what ended up happening was I was losing money as a professional going to all these recording studios. So I thought I should open a recording studio. So I found a business partner, opened a recording studio. And when you have a recording studio, you have to record whatever comes in. And a lot of what came in at the time was pop singers. And I started recording them, and I was also writing music for them. And I started doing a lot of music for drag queens and reality TV stars, and I thought it would be wise to disaggregate my given name from the production work I was doing in the not classical and not film scorey space. And so I decided to use Electropoint, and I still do a lot of work as a producer for reality TV stars mostly. And I still use that name just to differentiate the work I'm, it's kind of come together where directors don't really care that you can do pop music, and pop musicians don't really care that you can do film music. It used to be a little bit more like, that guy is writing EDM music, he's not going to be able to do orchestral stuff for our film. And that's why I really separated it back then. But now it doesn't seem to really make much of a difference.
So your studio, just to give proper credit to your recording studio, it's Mirrortone, correct?
Yes.
And that's in New York City?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And that keeps you pretty busy, I would assume, when you're not scoring films?
Yeah. I mean, not as much as it used to. I mean, I live in Los Angeles now, and the studio's in New York City, and we have engineers that run it for us these days because the film work has kind of taken over my life. And I still go back. I go back to New York maybe once a month or once every other month during COVID. And, I'll go for recording sessions or to record artists or to work on film scoring stuff where I need a space to actually record some of it.
Nice. A random question. I forgot to ask you about, it's a prior interview that you did where you talked about Mad Max Fury Road and the sound design on that film. I know you weren't involved in that, but that you were impressed with the sound design. And my question is, what is sound design on a movie?
Sure. So, I mean, that's a really big topic, but the simplest way to describe it for people who might not be familiar is the sounds that are not the music. But it's much more, so when somebody's walking, the footsteps, when a gun fires, the sound of the gun, that kind of basic stuff. But most of the time when we're talking about sound designers now, it's a whole department that will also be dealing with, like for example, with like Huracán or Snakehead, my studio did the sound design as well. My business partner, Jay, did all of the sound design. And what he needed to do was not only edit the dialogue, in really big productions and in studios, productions, sometimes these roles are all separate, but the sound designer is the head of that department, and they'll deal with everything such as editing the dialogue, making sure it's clear and mixed properly, putting in all of the Foley, which is what people generally think of when they think of sound design, like Foley sounds, like stabbing watermelons and breaking celery sticks and, that kind of sound design,
right?
Like punches and things. But it's also like dropping in the wind when they're outside, dropping into the program, the sound of wind and mixing that in, and then balancing out the dialogue, the sound effects and the music in the final mix. And then it gets even more technical than that, which is mixing for other formats like surround sound or Dolby Atmos.
Okay.
And yeah, it's very technical after a certain point. It's no longer creative,
I've noticed, I didn't know the word for it for sound design, but I've noticed in horror films that the sound design is super important in terms of footsteps and creaks of doors and, all the sounds of horror movies. So that's the sound design department, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I mean, on some films, there is a bit of a blur, like specifically in a horror film, and I've worked on films where I did both, which is really wonderful. It's very time consuming and it's not always reasonable to do that. Or if you work closely with the sound designer, because like in a horror film, like you're saying, maybe it's not the sound of the wind when they're alone in the cabin. Maybe it's like the bow scratching on the neck of the violin that's standing in for the wind. And those kind of decisions where you have sound designy music or music that was created using non-traditional instruments, sometimes it falls into the category of sound design, and those individuals need to work closely together to carry out the wishes of the director. But they blur sometimes these days, depending on what kind of production and the skill set of the individuals working on it.
Fascinating discussion. Thank you for explaining your world.
Sure.
I feel like I know the film and television world in terms of sound design and music so much better now. And you're very generous with your time, Roman. Roman Molino Dunn, thank you for being on Dream Path Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, and also really appreciate all the time you've spent with me.
Hey, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, I have a favor to ask. Can you go to wherever you listen to podcasts and leave me a review? Your feedback is what keeps this podcast going. You can also check us out on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook with the handle @DreamPathPod. And as always, go find your dream path.